Elena Marsh had worked at the Kensington estate for 8 months, and in all that time, she had never once let anyone glimpse the woman she used to be. She wore the pale lavender uniform of the household staff, kept her dark curly hair pinned neatly beneath a small cap, and moved through the mansion's marble hallways with the quiet, efficient grace of someone who had trained herself never to be noticed. It was, in its own strange way, the hardest role she had ever played, harder than anything she'd done in her previous life, because it required her to stay small in a world that had once demanded she be anything but, before the uniform, before the estate, before the name Elena Marsh had even settled comfortably on her own tongue. She had spent 6 years working in specialized close protection and tactical training, the kind of work that didn't show up on a resume and didn't come with references anyone could call. She had walked away from that life for reasons she didn't discuss with anyone, reasons that had left her needing quiet, needing anonymity, needing a job where nobody looked at her twice. Domestic work at a sprawling estate owned by a reclusive tech billionaire named Grant Kensington had seemed like exactly that. Grant was rarely home, buried in work most of the year, and the household ran itself on routine and discretion. It had been, for 8 months, the peaceful life Elena had been chasing. That peace ended the night. Grant returned from an extended business trip with his new fiancée in tow. Her name was Camille Dupree, and she arrived at the estate the way a storm arrives, all at once and impossible to ignore. She was strikingly beautiful, polished in the specific way that came from money that had always been there, and she had a habit Elena noticed within the first hour of speaking to the staff as though they were furniture that occasionally required correcting. Camille didn't yell. That would have been too obvious, too easy to report. Instead, she used a particular tone, sweet on the surface and cutting underneath, the kind of voice that could humiliate someone in front of a room full of people while technically saying nothing rude at all. Elena had encountered women like Camille before, in another lifetime in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and she recognized the type instantly. She kept her head down, did her work, and told herself that whatever discomfort she felt was temporary. Grant would marry Camille or he wouldn't, and either way, Elena's job was to stay invisible until it no longer mattered. The trouble started 3 weeks later, on the night of Grant and Camille's Engagement Gala, an event so large that Grant had rented out the estate's entire east wing and ballroom to accommodate the nearly 200 guests arriving from every corner of his professional and social world. The household staff had been preparing for days, polishing silver, arranging flowers, rehearsing the choreography of service that made these enormous events run smoothly. Elena had been assigned to the ballroom floor itself, moving quietly among the crowd, refilling glasses, clearing empty plates, doing the 1,000 invisible tasks that made a party feel effortless to the people attending it. She had almost made it through the entire evening without incident when it happened. Camille had spent much of the night holding court in the center of the ballroom, dressed in a deep blue gown that caught the chandelier light every time she moved, laughing loudly at her own jokes, accepting compliments like they were owed to her. She had been drinking steadily since the toasts began, and by the time the dessert course was cleared, her sharp edges had lost whatever polish they'd started the evening with. Elena had been crossing the floor with an empty serving tray when Camille, mid-story to a circle of admiring guests, took a wide, careless step backward without looking and collided directly into her. It wasn't Elena's fault. Anyone watching closely would have seen that clearly. But Camille, embarrassed in front of her audience and already unsteady on her heels, turned the moment into something else entirely. She rounded on Elena with a look of theatrical outrage, informing the gathering crowd in a voice pitched to Carrie that the clumsy help had nearly knocked her over, that this was exactly the kind of incompetence Grant needed to address with his staff. And then, before Elena could even respond, before anyone could intervene, Camille drew back her leg and delivered a sharp, deliberate kick to the back of Elena's knee, sending her stumbling down onto the marble floor in front of nearly 200 witnesses. The ballroom went silent in that particular, suffocating way large rooms do when something has gone terribly publicly wrong. A cleaning bucket that had been resting near the edge of the dance floor tipped over from the commotion, spilling soapy water across the marble in a small, humiliating puddle beside Elena's kneeling body. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped. Somewhere else, a man in a red suit stepped forward instinctively as if to help, then hesitated. uncertain whether it was his place. Grant, who had been across the room deep in conversation, turned at the sound and went very still. Elena knelt there for a moment on the wet marble floor, her cheeks burning with an old, familiar heat that had nothing to do with embarrassment. It was the particular stillness she recognized from her old life. The moment right before a decision, the pause where the body waits to see what the mind will allow it to do. Every instinct trained into her. Over 6 years of specialized work screamed at her to rise, to move, to respond the way she'd been taught to respond to a physical attack. She could have had Camille disarmed and restrained in under 2 seconds without breaking a sweat. She knew exactly which pressure points would drop a person twice. Camille's sighs to the floor without leaving a mark, for one long, dangerous heartbeat. The woman she used to be strained against the uniform she was wearing. But Elena had left that life behind for a reason, and she had not spent 8 months building a quiet existence just to burn it down over one drunk woman's cruelty. So instead, slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet on her own power, smoothed the front of her lavender uniform, and looked Camille directly in the eye with a calm that seemed to unsettle the other woman far more than any outburst would have. "You should be more careful," Elena said, quietly enough that only Camille and the small circle around her could hear it clearly. Someone could get hurt. It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but something in the way Elena said it, in the perfect stillness of her posture, in the eyes that didn't waver or flinch or fill with the tears. Camille had clearly expected, made several people in the immediate circle go quiet in a different way. Camille, flustered and aware suddenly that the crowd's sympathy had shifted somewhere she hadn't anticipated, laughed too loudly and tried to wave the moment away as an accident, insisting Elena had simply gotten in her way. It was at that moment that Grant reached them, having crossed the ballroom floor faster than anyone had seen him move all evening. He didn't look at Camille first. He looked at Elena, taking in the soapy puddle, the overturned bucket, the small crowd of frozen witnesses, and something in his expression hardened in a way the staff had never seen from their normally reserved, distracted employer. He asked Elena, directly and without preamble, if she was all right, and something in the sincerity of the question, so different from Camille's practiced performances, made the tension in the circle around them shift again. Camille tried to recover, launching into an explanation that painted herself as the victim of a careless accident, her voice climbing in pitch, the way it did whenever she felt control slipping away from her. But Grant wasn't looking at her anymore. He had turned to a cluster of nearby guests, several of whom had clearly witnessed the entire exchange, and asked calmly what they had seen. The answers came haltingly at first, guests reluctant to embarrass their host on his own engagement night. But the truth came out in pieces, confirmed by enough voices that there was no version of events left where Camille's story held together. What happened next surprised everyone in that ballroom, including, for a brief and strange moment, Elena herself. Grant didn't shout. He didn't make a scene beyond what had already been made. He simply turned to Camille, his voice quiet but absolutely final, and told her that the engagement was over, effective immediately, and that he would appreciate her packing her things before the end of the night. Camille's face went through disbelief, fury, and finally a kind of desperate, pleading confusion. But Grant had already turned away from her, already walking toward Elena with an expression that had nothing performative in it at all. He asked if she needed anything, if she wanted the rest of the night off, if there was anything he could do to make the situation right. Elena, still faintly aware of the ache blooming behind her knee where the kick had landed, found herself oddly moved by the plainness of the offer, the total absence of pity in it. She told him she was fine, that she'd like to finish her shift if that was all right, because the alternative, sitting alone somewhere replaying the moment, sounded far worse than simply going back to work. Grant didn't argue, but he also didn't leave her side for the rest of the evening, quietly checking in every so often, in a way that felt less like an employer's obligation and more like something he genuinely couldn't help doing. By the time the last guests had trickled out and the ballroom had emptied into exhausted silence, something unspoken had shifted between them, small and fragile and entirely unplanned. In the weeks that followed, word of what had happened moved through the household staff the way these things always do, quietly and thoroughly, until everyone knew the shape of the story, even if the details blurred. slightly with each retelling. What surprised Elena most wasn't the gossip which she'd expected, but the way people started looking at her differently, not with pity, as she'd feared, but with a kind of quiet respect she hadn't earned in any way they knew about. They didn't know about the 6 years, the training, the life she'd left behind to disappear into this one. They only knew that she had been struck in front of 200 people and had risen from the floor with more dignity than anyone in that ballroom, including the woman who'd put her there. Grant began finding small excuses to seek her out. First with simple check-ins that felt genuine rather than obligatory, then with longer conversations that stretched past their original reason for starting. Conversations where Elena found herself, for the first time in years, allowing someone to see fragments of who she really was. She never told him everything. Some doors once closed were meant to stay that way, but she told him enough about the training, about the reasons for leaving it behind, about the specific and hard-won peace she'd built for herself. In this quiet corner of his enormous house, he listened in a way that made her believe he actually understood, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Elena kept working at the estate, though her role shifted slowly over the following months, less about polishing silver and more about the kind of trust that couldn't be assigned by a title. She never became someone Grant flaunted or displayed, and that suited her fine. What she became instead was someone he genuinely wanted near him, someone whose calm in the face of chaos he had witnessed firsthand and never forgotten. Camille, for her part, vanished from the estate that same night and never returned, though her name lingered for a while in the careful, hushed way scandal always does among people who like to talk. Nobody who had been in that ballroom ever quite forgot the sight of her drunk and cruel, humiliating a woman she assumed had no power to answer back, only to watch that same woman rise from the floor with more composure than Camille had managed in her entire polished, privileged life. Elena thought about that night often in the months that followed, not with anger, because the anger had faded quickly, but with a kind of quiet gratitude for the restraint she'd shown, for the woman she'd chosen to be instead of the one she used to be. She had spent so long believing that leaving her old life behind meant becoming smaller, meant disappearing entirely into invisibility. What she learned instead, kneeling on that wet marble floor with 200 strangers watching, was that real strength had never required her to prove anything at all. It only required her to stand back up,